The problem is not in the loss of income. The problem is in the loss of purpose for the work. And honestly, like this study even indicates maybe a deeper problem, which is that people don't just want to do work. It's almost like they need their work to be wanted or needed. Because if you look at the way that people are spending their time again here with this UBI study, it would be nice if we could say the story is like, oh, they received this $1,000 and they spent more time with their kids or they exercised more. Like that's just not what happened. What happened was like this increase in leisure. And so I think that this makes the argument against UBI even stronger with reference to the AI changes that are going on. UBI almost becomes more dangerous with the AI stuff that's happening when you consider this.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I'm going to be speaking with Peter Jacobsen, who is Assistant Professor of Economics at Ottawa University, the Gwartney Professor of Economic Education and Research at the Gwartney Institute, and Interim Director of Business Graduate Programs at Ottawa University in Kansas. His research is at the intersection of entrepreneurship, development economics, and population economics. And today specifically, I have Peter on to discuss, he recently wrote an article for the public summarizing a study on UBI, Universal Basic Income, and some of the claims made on behalf of UBI programs by its proponents didn't pan out in this particular study, at least. And so I have him on to discuss the results. And let me say, I did some due diligence. I ran his summary by a left-leaning economist who's a buddy of mine that I think is intellectually honest. And I just said, hey, do you agree with this assessment of what the study found? And my guy said, yeah, this is basically correct. So I did want to just bounce it off of someone who would be more predisposed to favorably interpret the results on a UBI study. And so you have it from the other side that what Peter's going to say is, in fact, the truth. And that's what we strive to give you here at the InFi podcast. So without further ado, here is my discussion about UBI with Peter Jacobsen. Peter, welcome to the InFi podcast.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's a pleasure to be on. I've followed your work for years. Actually, got to listen to you talk probably a decade ago at the Mises Institute. So I really appreciate you having me on.
Oh, very interesting. All right. I'm glad. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Well, you have an article at FI, which caught my eye, and it ran back on October 14th of 2024. The title they gave was "The Largest Study Ever on UBI Was Just Conducted. The Results Are Disappointing for Advocates." And so maybe just Peter first, explain what is UBI, and maybe we'll get into a little bit about the broader context, and then we'll dive into your specific article.
Yeah, for sure. So for the layperson, the most likely place that you've heard about UBI, at least if you're in the United States, was when Andrew Yang was running for president in 2020. He was running for president on this idea of giving everybody $1,000. That was kind of his tagline. Mm-hmm. And that was an example of a UBI policy. UBI stands for Universal Basic Income. The forms of it vary, but the general idea is instituting a welfare program that gives everybody some consistent amounts of money, some period, whether that's every month, every year. And generally, it's not means tested. In other words, regardless if you're rich, poor, young, old, or whatever, you receive that same basic income. So Yang's proposal was $1,000 a month of universal basic income.
Okay, so the U for universal means it's not tied to your income. So normally people think of like welfare or food stamps or something as for the needy, but the idea is here that no, that by design, that's kind of the whole point, that everybody gets it.
Yeah, and that's one of the claimed advantages of UBI is that sometimes you worry with means-tested programs that you're going to disincentivize people from working or getting married or things like that. Our current welfare system maybe does that. So the UBI advocates claim, well, if, and this is a good conditional if we were to replace the current welfare system, we could get rid of some of those disincentives when we use UBI instead.
Yeah, and there's actually, it might surprise some listeners to hear this, there are some generally free market economist types, like Mike Munger's one. I know, I don't know if he still supports it, but I know historically he was a proponent of UBI. And that was exactly what you say there, Peter, that the point was you're saying, no, maybe if we started from scratch and there was no government support for anybody, maybe it would be a bad idea. But given the system right now, as you say, Peter, there are implicit, very high marginal tax rates for certain ranges of income. So for example, somebody who's like a single mother with 4 kids and only earns $20,000 a year from some sporadic jobs, she gets a lot of support, not just in terms of like food stamps and things like that, but maybe apartment subsidies and Obamacare subsidies and all that.
So like if she were to all of a sudden double her income,
Yeah.
to the extent that some of those other things get clawed back on net, her standard of living doesn't go up that much. So there's a sense in which she's facing a very high marginal tax rate. And so what's in it for her to, go take that extra job or go back to school or whatever?
Yeah.
That's kind of the idea.
The benefits cliff, right? Or to get married. That's another major one is we've got a lot of situations where if people decide to get married, which that's what would be beneficial for society, then they're going to lose a lot of benefits. And so the incentive is for them to, rather than get married and, make their relationship concrete, to stay in this sort of unmarried flux. So that way they can take advantage of the benefits.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so then part of the argument over this is just people making different claims about what would be the impact on, work incentives and things like that. Because, some people worry, well, gee, if the government is just handing out money to people, regardless of what they do, might not a lot of people then decide, hey, I don't need to, depending on how generous that monthly check is, might some people. So that's partly what the dispute is over. And what also may surprise some listeners is there have been experiments in place where either governments or private foundations just got a sample of people and just started giving them money and tracked it for 3 years and such. So anyway, do you want to now go into that and maybe start talking about the specific content of your article?
Yeah, no, I think we could talk about the study. The one thing I would add with respect to what you just said is, that kind of worry is pretty sound economic theory. Leisure is a good, like getting to relax is a good thing. People enjoy it. People are even willing to pay to have some leisure time. And so as with any good, once you receive income, you're going to consume more of it, right? That's everything else up constant. That's what we would expect. So the econ theory is pretty sound that UBI, I would expect, would result in more leisure. But there are these questions about, well, the degree to which this happens. And then are there other beneficial aspects that outweigh that increase in leisure on the margin? So I think that's really where the crux of the argument comes down with the UBI people.
Okay, great. Do you want to maybe dive into the specifics of the study that you summarized?
Absolutely. So the study was by a series of authors, Vivalt, Rhodes, Bardick, and Brookman and Miller, all from different universities. So we've got University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, Berkeley, a few others. And they had a working paper for the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is sort of the economic research organization where big time working papers are supported, a place that a lot of economists go to kind of look and see what's up and coming. And the paper is titled The Employment Effects of a Guaranteed Income, Experimental Evidence from 2 U.S. States. And so basically this study they found 1,000 low-income individuals, and they were randomized into receiving either $1,000 per month unconditionally for 3 years. And so $1,000 every single month for 3 years. We got 36 months there. Or there was also a control group that received something like $50 per month. And basically what they did is they tracked a ton of things with respect to this money. They tracked people's working hours. They tracked what they did with their time. They had them download like a phone app so they could log their time as part of the conditions for getting this money. And basically, they just tried to answer, well, we know what the econ theory is, empirically, how big are these effects? And that's what they went through and did.
And in terms of, for people who aren't familiar with this terminology, like the randomized assignment, the idea is because in practice, it's hard to look at, like you might say, oh, let's go look at the people who receive food stamps and see how much do they work, and then go look at people who aren't on food stamps and how much do they work. But you might be getting the causality mixed up.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not clear. So it's not that, food stamps cause you to be poor if the reason you're getting food stamps is because you are poor. So it's, right. Whereas here, they're just grabbing people randomly and then deciding, like flipping a coin and saying you're either going to get the 1,000 a month or the 50 a month.
Yeah, the idea is if you select on one group, you might accidentally pick up like attributes that are hidden in the group, right? As opposed to if you select randomly, you're getting maybe something a little more representative of the whole population or something like that. So yeah, exactly. That's the idea.
Okay, great. So then, do you want to start walking through what some of their findings were?
Yeah. So first of all, unsurprisingly, what we see right off the bat and some of the most statistically significant findings, in other words, the ones that were the clearest in the research, were that ignoring the money that people receive from the transfers, people's income went down. In other words, if you forget about the transfer money for a second, you just look, well, what happened to your income over the year? It decreased, and it tended to decrease for individuals in the range from $1,500 to $2,500 a year. And so people had lower incomes. And so obviously the next question from that is why? Why would that happen? Well, it turns out that exactly what economic theory would predict happens. That is, when people receive that money, they worked less. And so the estimates range about 1.3 hours per week, which doesn't sound like a lot, but once you add that up over 3 years, it actually does start to get pretty large. And over a large group, it gets even larger. So that's one aspect, is people worked less hours. The second aspect is that people also stayed unemployed for longer. And so when people lost their jobs, the people who were on this UBI program tended to take a little bit longer, about a month longer, to find a job than the people who weren't on the UBI. And so there's some clear downsides. Now, some of the proponents of the UBI
Hey, Peter, can I just want to make sure people understand what that headline number meant. So again, for the people with all this stuff, they were doing it, the control group versus the treatment group. So the people that got the treatment, they got $1,000 a month for 3 years. And the idea is, so there's a sense in which right off the bat, they have $12,000 more than they otherwise would have.
Yes.
But you're saying, putting that aside and then saying how much did they earn from the marketplace, that is the thing that relative to the control group dropped.
Yeah, we could think of it, their wages and salaries went down.
Right.
Okay. That would be one way to put it.
So they still had a lot more money at the end of the year than their mirror image in the control group. But the point is, they did cut back on how much they were earning from. If the program gave them $12,000, they didn't have $12,000 more of total money flowing in during the year because they partially cut back on how much they were earning from other sources.
Yeah, they had anywhere from like 9,000 to like 11,000 at the end of the year. So I handed you 12 and you turned it into 9 to 11, basically.
Right. Okay. And then again, just to give the basic intuition of that, the way you're explaining it, Peter, was to say there's a sense in which here's an extra $12,000 a year. What do you want to do with it? They might buy more food. They might go on vacation. And they might buy more leisure in the sense of, oh, I don't have to work as much. So there's a sense in which I'm using that money to, quote, buy more hours back from my potential employer.
Yeah. And I don't think this is terribly controversial. Now, a lot of UBI advocates will try to argue, no, this isn't really going to happen that much. But most of the reasonable ones do admit that, yeah, you're going to have some leisure effects. One of the surprising findings of the study, though, is it wasn't contained to the person receiving the UBI. So, for example, in situations where the person who was receiving the income was part of a family, the spouse's working hours also decreased by a smaller extent, but they still decreased. So there's sort of even this secondary effect going on where like the people in the lives of the person who receives this basic income, they also purchase more leisure that way.
Which I guess isn't shocking.
No,
right?
Not.
Like if, it makes sense that if one spouse all of a sudden gets a raise, maybe the other one doesn't work as much. And
it's totally reasonable. It's exactly what we would expect. Unfortunately, for UBI advocates, you would want to find a small or even like a nothing impact. Now, some of them do argue then, and this is the general argument for UBI, is maybe people will work a little less, but UBI is going to free them up for other productive avenues. And so, for example, those people who stayed unemployed for an extra month, maybe they stayed unemployed for an extra month and that let them find a better job. That's at least one of the theoretical benefits. And basically, when the researchers looked at the numbers, they basically didn't find any evidence that happens. People applied more selectively to jobs, but they weren't able to see in any like clear differences in the types of jobs that they applied for or any sort of like quality changes in terms of employment. So, that idea that like, well, if we give people that security net, they're going to find a job that's a little bit more, suited to them and that's going to help them in the future or something like that. It just didn't bear out the evidence in any obvious way.
And do you know, so I understand. So it did result in them searching longer for a job, meaning that the spells of their unemployment was longer, as you say. But then how do they quantify? Do you know when they say like, oh, they didn't end up getting a better job?
I'd have to dive a little more into the data. I think what they tried to like look at several different like senses, like the type of work that was done, the hours, the salary. I think they looked at several different measures and just didn't find any noticeable differences between that and the control group. So I'd have to double check into the data a little bit more to see that. But I have the summary from the authors that we don't see much in the way of differences in the types of jobs the participants applied for. The results do not support any changes in the quality of employment.
Okay, and then do you want to comment at all? Like you have this nice bar chart. I guess Fee made this, but just talking about like some of the things, like the minutes dropping versus the minutes being gained during their day, and like how they adjusted.
Yeah, so that's right. That was made by the folks at the data visualization team at Fee. So they did a great job with that, based on obviously the data from the researchers. And so this is another claim by UBI advocates, is they'll say like, yeah, it's true that people maybe will work less or something like that, but they're going to be able to do more fulfilling things. And so they're going to pursue their passions, the arts, entrepreneurship, spend more time with family, children, those sorts of things. And so basically this policy debate becomes this game of like, we agree with you in theory, but in practice, the benefits will outweigh the costs. That's what the advocates will say. And so what these researchers did, again, is they logged the time that people spend doing things. And these results are varying degrees of statistically significant versus not, just meaning that like researchers can be reasonably sure that they aren't random versus not being reasonably sure. But what they find is basically none of those positive categories that people claim are going to be the result of UBI had any noticeable uptick that was statistically significant in terms of minutes. And so the things that people did more, we have like an other category. Obviously, the catch-all is going to have the most. But then we had things like social leisure. People spent like 37 more minutes per day or something like that. Non-commuting transportation. So people driving around more often. Solitary leisure, home production. So that's just like doing chores around your house. Self-care and time with others. Those are kind of the major ones that have increases. Time with others being the smallest. And so each of those were like 5-6 minutes per day, somewhere between 0 and 5 for all of those in terms of an increase. And so most of those, just looking at it from my point of view, look like leisure activities. Obviously, home production is maybe a little bit different than that, but the category of social leisure being the largest non-other category sort of tells you what you need to know in terms of what people are doing with this time. On the other hand, if you look at the things that decreased in terms of minutes per day, exercise was one of the things. Going back to our previous conversation, people actually searched for a job less minutes a day after UBI. Not much. Again, it's a very tiny amount, a minute or less per day, but still noticeable. Self-improvement, caring for others, community engagements, other income generating activity, childcare, even sleeping. Like all of these things that like we would think of as like being the sorts of things that you would want to do, prioritizing your health through sleeping and fitness, prioritizing your family, prioritizing your community. Those sorts of things that people claim are the benefit of UBI in terms of people's freedom. We don't see in this study any noticeable uptick in the time spent in those activities.
Yeah, it is interesting because, again, just to kind of underscore what you're saying there, like the child care is one that I would have guessed would have been the other way around.
Yeah.
Certainly if the empirical reality was what the proponents said, that, there are a lot of people that if they had more income, like you could imagine, it would free up. And so maybe one of the parents wouldn't have to work as much now that they have this basic income coming in, so they can free them up to spend time with the kids. But it looks like if anything, it allowed them to hire a sitter so they could go on a hike.
Yeah, something like that, right? I agree with you. Like my intuition would have been the same. Like I would have expected people would have spent a lot more time on self-improvement, community engagement, exercise. Like I would have been with the UBI advocates and thinking, sure, on the margin, people are going to increase those things. But again, like insofar as this study finds anything, it finds that there's no noticeable changes in those positive categories, if not negative changes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you know these authors, were they proponents of the UBI? Like, were they surprised going in? Like, were they disappointed as these results? Or do you have a sense of that?
Now that you mention it, I think I did see somewhere that the authors were going into it expecting different results. But it seemed towards the end, essentially, to say that like they find very little in terms of positive changes. They do note, like, it's clear that they're trying to provide somewhat of an upside to the case. So one example of that is, one of the things they mention is, well, we do find some evidence, for example, that UBI increases entrepreneurial tendencies. And so this is kind of trying to put a positive spin on it. But when you look into the paper on that a little bit more, and I don't think the authors are being deceived or anything with this. I just think that they were trying to find as many things as they could. But when you look into those numbers, what you actually see is the authors find an increase in people's intention to start a business or something like that over 3 years. But that doesn't translate into any noticeable metric in reality. So there's no increase in actually starting business. There's no increase in like applying for business licenses or buying inventory. So I think the authors try to give UBI as fair of a shake as possible. They point out as many positive outcomes as they can. There just aren't that many to point out, though.
Right. So does this sound correct to you, Peter, that given the way they're, the metrics and whatnot, so that like home production that went up, whatever it is, 3 or 4 minutes a day on average, that could include if somebody is going to switch to, I always wanted to have a t-shirt business that I run out of my basement or something, and that would catch that. But yet we know that their income from the market went down. So whatever you want to say about that, it's not that in aggregate that the people the treatment group receiving the payments ended up generating, like even if you thought 1 out of 10 of them hit a home run and had a good business that they launched, that should pull up the averages the way these figures work.
Yeah, and they do survey people on whether or not they actually started businesses too, and they don't find any results there in terms of like the actual application. So yeah, you might have the t-shirt business out of the house or something like that, but again, on the large scale, we're just not finding in this study any evidence that people actually, can feel like, oh, I can now take on a risk because I've got this UBI backstop and I'm going to do the thing I've always dreamed of doing. That narrative just didn't seem to play out in this case.
So do you know, I suppose like if it were my job to try to spin this, I'm trying to steel man the other side, I might bring up and say, well, the fact that everybody knew that this was just a temporary thing, that might make these results different from if this were just like the built-in structure of what your life was going to be like. But what's weird is I would think if anything, that would make it worse.
Yeah.
In other words, given that you're just going to get $1,000 a month for 3 years and then it turns off, I would think that would distort your... Well, anyway, I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, I the way that I would generally think about it is, if you have like this temporary boost in income, the general thinking is that when you have a temporary boost in income, you sort of capitalize off that boost of income. And so if there's one time in your life where you're going to be partially, not totally, obviously, because $1,000 a month is enough to totally subsidize consumption for most people, but partially subsidizing your consumption for 3 years straight, you would think that you would use that opportunity, if any, in order to try to start that business or go back to school. That was another one that they tried to look at and just did not find any convincing evidence that there was an uptick. Whereas if it were for the rest of your life, as you pointed out, that actually to me seems like it's more likely to increase the possibility of you leisuring, right? The way that I would think about it is you can either have use this small opportunity to boost your income forever after by going to school or starting a business or whatever. But if this is a permanent activity, well, the income's boosted forever after just by nature of it existing. So I would expect actually in the long run, more people doing the leisure thing with a permanent UBI than with this temporary one. Yeah, I agree that the steel man is very difficult here. I'll give you one other piece of positive evidence that they find for the steel man. It is in this education front. What they say is they don't find significant improved education outcomes, but they do find particular subgroups that have suggestive evidence of increase in schooling. And so, for example, if you get really into the data, they find that people in their 20s, they say we have some evidence to suggest that those people who received the UBI in their 20s did a little bit more of going back to school and that sort of thing, but not enough to make any conclusive claims about it. And so you can find within the population a subgroup here, a subgroup there, a little bit of entrepreneurial attitude improvement, maybe a year of school here and there, but it's just hard to steel man.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of it both in terms of a thought experiment, but also historically, what you and I are both thinking would happen is correct. That just, again, the thought experiment, if somebody wins the lotto and wins $20,000 in one fell swoop and that's it, they're not going to quit their job.
No. Yeah.
But if you thought you were going to get $20,000 a year or a month, just to exaggerate it, for the rest of your life, then a lot of people would quit their job immediately. And so, you can make the numbers smaller, but still that effect, you would think that, other things equal, the more limited the subsidy, the less that should affect your employment, because it's not like you're saying it's just a more temporary windfall that you're going to then use to bulk up your bank account or something and then increase your long-run consumption, like in terms of a Milton Friedman, lifetime income hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then empirically, just to say, okay, there's your little thought experiment, but people aren't taking first derivatives with the utility function, idiots. Okay, but empirically, over time, humanity, the wage rate of humans has gone up. We are more productive. We have higher lifetime incomes now than in the year 1600. And people work a lot less now than they did in the year 1600, right? That, in other words, we enjoy a lot more leisure now. So that fits as well. So if you're going to view the UBI program as sort of raising the standard of living or the floor, then you would expect everybody to not work as much. Just like in the Jetsons cartoon, the people in that world don't work 40 hours a week.
Right.
And so that's kind of what you would expect. So it seems kind of crazy if the UBI people are going to try to argue that wouldn't happen. You would think, if anything, they would say, yes, that would happen, and that's the sign of progress. That's why everyone should support this, because now you only got to work 32 hours a week instead of 40 or whatever the numbers are.
Yeah. And some of the honest supporters of UBI, I did kind of look through some different places to see the comments, social media, various places. And some of the honest supporters just said, well, what I always wanted out of UBI was that people work less. And so this is functioning exactly as intended. And fair enough to those people who think that's the goal. We did find there's a little bit more leisure in the system. The problem I see, though, is usually that is accompanied by some claim of but the productivity losses will be offset by this, or this. And, we're just not finding any this, or this.
Right.
Yeah, I think your lottery example is the perfect example. I would expect, who's more likely to quit their job after they win the lottery? The guy who wins the Mega Millions or the guy who wins 20,000? Like, it's obvious to me. And so I think you're right. That kind of builds a tough case for this temporary UBI relative to a permanent one.
And then here, we've just been focusing on what happens to the recipients. We haven't asked, well, where's the money coming from? And so then to me, that's like the real nail in the coffin for this thing. If it's a government funded redistribution program, that how are they going to scale this, right? So in other words, here, they did a very limited thing. They grabbed a sample of people. They gave $1,000 a month for 3 years or whatever the number you said. But now if we wanted to extrapolate, say, okay, so let's do Andrew Yang's proposal. Well, to give every American $1,000 a month, that's going to cost a lot of money. Where are you going to get that from? And so when you then factor in, like, I've just seen different examples, and I have never seen one that worked where the arithmetic just held up to say, if you really were going to pay enough so that you could live off of it, because that's kind of the idea too, that when they say basic income, a lot of them mean it's enough that it wouldn't be a luxury living, but that, yeah, you could actually survive just on this check that comes in every month. So if the number is going to be high enough to do that, and then you got to multiply it by everybody, that's a pretty big overhead that the government has to come up with. And then however you're going to tax that, then it's like you're getting a double whammy, that the marginal tax rates on the high income earners have to be high enough to fund that big program. And then when you take into account what we just talked about, that and no matter what you do, you get this basic subsidy. It's like, why is anybody working anymore?
Yeah, I mean, what thing in our society is the closest to UBI out of anything we have? Like, it's got to be our social security system, right? Now, it's not a perfect UBI system. It's age dependent, obviously, but once you're past a certain age, it's not like you don't qualify or something like that if you're rich. So it's maybe our closest thing. This is the system that is the least sustainable out of all of our systems, right? It's like the system that everybody's worried about whether we can upkeep it next decade or so. We're either going to have to cut the system down or increase taxes. Again, I think that's just a good allusion to the facts that if we wanted this to be done society-wide, tax rates are going to have to go through the roof. And as pointed out earlier, one of the difficulties is, let's say we're doing the $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year. You keep it pretty low like that, which again, this was pointed out, not nearly enough to live off of for someone's entire life, but $12,000 a year. Well, that means the $12,000 a year is coming from someone, obviously, as you pointed out, taxed, from by and large, the higher level of wealth and income in our society, taxed from those people. But with that $12,000 transfer, the person, again, is receiving about $10,000 to $12,000 of income. They're receiving less income on net because of their leisure. And so you're basically transforming $12,000 into $10,000. And so this is ignoring the benefit of leisure, which we can't totally ignore, but by ignoring the benefit of leisure, this is a negative sum game. Obviously, we're taking money from one place, giving it to another place, and then it's getting smaller. So apart from that leisure, it really is sort of a destructive policy in an obvious sense.
And then also, again, the proponent could come back and say, yeah, you guys are right. If we were starting from ground zero, implementing this from scratch would probably be a bad idea, and it would discourage work effort, and total, GDP would be lower than it otherwise would be. Okay. But they're saying, we're not starting from scratch. We're starting with this crazy system we have right now where, yeah, there are still high marginal income tax rates, both explicitly in terms of the tax code, but also implicitly when you figure in all the benefit cliffs like we're talking about. And they say, oh, okay, but even there, if we could press that, I'm curious your thoughts, Peter. Suppose they do that. So, we got rid of food stamps, we got rid of, Obamacare and the blah, blah, blah. And it's just everybody gets a flat, whatever, $3,000 a month, and that's it. And it's up to you to budget properly. Okay, so some mother with 3 kids and she's not married, she gets the $3,000, maybe she gets a stipend for the kids too, who knows what. And then she goes and loses it all. And then says, my kids are going to starve. What the government's going to say, tough. Well, we have a UBI and, you should have known. So I don't believe it, that they would actually just let her starve to death.
Yeah, listen, the current government apparatus that we have for the welfare state is the result of a lot of lobbying by special interests. And so, you have people lobbying for benefits for like Medicare, Medicaid, that sort of thing. The point is, the transfer system that we have has a lot of beneficiaries, both the recipients of the aid, but also various interest groups who, like the food companies, I'm sure, who are WIC certified, probably love WIC, right? And so the idea that we're just going to remove women, infant, children, the WIC certification from things and give people the money to use as they want, to me, it's just an unrealistic idea that we're going to dissolve these special interests influence, replace all of the current safety net systems and replace it with this. Now, generally how this sort of thing works is you get both, right? You're not going to get rid of the current welfare system and replace it with a UBI system. You're going to get the current welfare system and the UBI system, maybe like a curtsy here and there to reducing the current welfare state or something like that. But as you mentioned before, it's actually not even obvious to me that not testing according to means is better, that the UBI is better. If my money is going to go to somewhere, it's not obvious to me that I wouldn't prefer it to go to more to women with like children who are struggling financially than to like some guy in college. That's up for debate. We could talk about like distortionary incentives and all that. But it just is, to me, it's in no sense obviously better than our current welfare system.
I'm glad you brought that up, Peter, because my question may have made it sound like I thought, oh yeah, there's all these freeloaders, like systems to all these single mothers walking around. and no, like I think you're right that the reason so many billions flow through these systems is because of lobbyists and, the large companies that benefit from this stuff. Gary Wolfram was one of my professors when I went to Hillsdale, and I remember it was a public choice course, and he was talking about, because he did a lot of work advising like the state government of Michigan, and he said he went to like some school lunch program hearings or whatever, in terms of the state of Michigan. Then he was saying, who do you think showed up at these meetings? Do you think it was like all of the representatives of all the poor inner city families? He goes, no, it was the food vendors, right? Like you said, the people that when the government spends all this money on school lunches, there are certain companies that get those contracts, and they care a lot about the budget for school lunches, and will lobby and so forth and take out ads and whatever. Oh yes, on this proposition, next ballot. So
yeah, I mean there's some benefit. Again, for example, like the WIC program allows women and spouses to buy certain types of food. So like, for example, bread is one type of food that you can get basically for free on the WIC program. Free in terms of your own personal money out of pocket, obviously costs someone something. But not all types of bread are WIC certified. You can only choose from certain brands, right? And so there's some attached value. I don't know what it is off the top of my head. Maybe even the companies don't know. But there's some value attached to your ability to be certified by WIC. And so let's just say that's $1 million. If you get $1 million of benefit being one of these WIC certified companies, you're going to be willing to spend up to $1 million in lobbying costs and talking to politicians, hopefully not in bribes, but maybe even in bribes, to get the system to exist. And so the cost of implementing the UBI system and replacing the welfare system has to include the cost of fighting all those special interest groups. And we know of a lot of wasteful welfare programs in our country that haven't been replaced. They probably haven't been replaced because it's expensive to replace them. And so to say this idea of like, well, if we were starting from scratch, we could pick the UBI and it would be a lower cost overall. Even if that's true, like even if that was correct, which I don't think the math usually works out for most proposals. But even if it was true, like you can't ignore the cost of the switching. Like it's a relevant cost. If it were costless to switch between bad and good systems, that we'd have a lot better of a political process than we do right now, possibly infeasibly good.
Yeah. And again, just to make sure the listener's not getting lost in our back and forth in the details,
Sure.
The point that I'm making, I think you're agreeing with me, Peter, is that, as you say, it's even if it were the case that, if we could just completely scrap the current system and do some UBI where the numbers made sense internally, arguably the disincentive work effects would be lower in the UBI approach relative to the current system.
Sure.
But that's a very unrealistic goal to have, and to hold that up is why we're doing this, because in practice, we'd probably get the worst of both worlds, where we would still have a lot of the existing means-tested programs in force, both because of the companies, the special interests that benefit from them, but also just the public, that, there'd be horror stories otherwise of, oh, geez, you cut these people off and, now that she got evicted from her apartment and now she's on the street and what are you doing? And so that I don't think the public would go for that. And then also, like you said, and then on top of that, now we just have this huge funnel of hundreds of billions more to everybody that has to be either financed by higher taxes or borrowing more, or running the printing press. So when all is said and done, it would just, I think, be a net expansion of government redistribution programs.
Yeah, listen, I like to swim. The nearest indoor pool is really far away from me. I could make an argument that my day would be a lot more efficient if I built a pool in my backyard. But if I say ignoring the cost of building the pool, I'd be more efficient. Like that's not an argument, right? Because you can't ignore the cost of building the pool. You can't ignore the cost of switching from the current welfare system to the UBI system, fighting those special interest groups, dealing with, like, again, the bad news story spins of children lunch program defunded for UBI for 20-year-olds in college. Like the headlines write themselves, right? You can't ignore that switching cost.
Yeah.
And then we've been focusing kind of on the narrow technical economic issues, but more generally, and this even feeds into a lot of the proponents of a UBI who are, like, I'm sure you've seen this, Peter, like there's a lot of billionaires that are saying, oh yeah, as AI comes and throws people out of work or whatever, there's going to be this growing portion of the population that just can't find work. And we better come up with some support programs so they're not going to revolt. And the idea that we're just going to transition and there's going to be millions of people who are just getting checks from the government to sit in a cubicle with a virtual reality headset on, like that creeps me out. Like that's going into the Matrix territory.
Yeah. No, it is sort of like this funny thing where oftentimes the same people, because I agree with you, this is one of the claims. It's like, well, we need the UBI for the people who are going to be displaced by the AI and the technology. That's the basic argument. But a lot of these same people will point to the problem of AI and technology displacing people being like there's some sort of like inherent dignity to work. People enjoy work or whatever. UBI does nothing to fix that. And I would say that is maybe even the deeper problem. Like if it's true that technology is just going to replace a large swath of the workforce, I don't think money's the primary problem. If it was, we could just give everybody enough stock in one of those technology companies to, be well off or whatever. We can imagine a lot of ways to do that. I think the bigger problem is humans, like whether it's anthropologically or whether it's something to do with theology or something, we have a sort of worth attached to our work. And I think that's true. You don't fix that by sitting everybody in a pod and giving them $1,000 distributions that they can use for whatever, like you said, whatever virtual reality house they want to buy. That doesn't fix the deeper problem. So in terms of a solution to artificial intelligence encroaching on work or something like this, I think this is like the bottom of the barrel solution.
Mm-hmm.
Like this would be the worst case scenario. If all we could do for people was give them a check every month, I think our society would be in pretty poor shape.
Yeah, and you touched on something there that I think economists sometimes, even free market economists, get wrong, where I've seen them say things like, the point of work is just to generate income, to consume, and it's like the whole point of everything is consumption, and ideally, if you could just be a consumer, that would be great. This is really great. And that at least doesn't line up with the Christian worldview. I mean, Adam and Eve, they had jobs. Like Adam had a job, even though the Garden of Eden, there was no scarcity in our sense of the term. So there is something to be said for that rather than being amazing, if all of our needs were met, like there is an argument that no, actually that would be terrible and we'd go nuts or something.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem worth solving. And the key recognition is that like the problem is not in the loss of income, like the problem is in the loss of purpose for the work. And honestly, like this study even indicates maybe a deeper problem, which is that people don't just want to do work. It's almost like they need their work to be wanted or needed. Because if you look at the way that people are spending their time again here with this UBI study, it would be nice if we could say the story is like, oh, they received this $1,000 and they spent more time with their kids. And, they started like a business that maybe wasn't as profitable as their work, but they had a lot of value in it. Like all that stuff would be nice if we could say that, or they exercise more, like that's maybe a type of work. That's just not what happened. What happened was like this increase in leisure. And so I think that this makes the argument against UBI even stronger with reference to the AI changes that are going on. UBI almost becomes more dangerous with the AI stuff that's happening when you consider this.
Okay, well, maybe one final question for you, Peter. Somebody's listening to this, they might say, okay, yeah, I agree with you, but all right, Peter, what's your solution then? What do we do? Just everything's great? Or do you have some better proposal?
Yeah, a better proposal. Man, that's always the question, right? Listen, I think that it kind of related to where we were just talking. I think that there is a sort of like responsibility for individuals in their communities to recognize that there are both people who are going to be in need of constant assistance. I think that's very clear, but also B, in need of something to do. Like that I think that's just like a matter of fact that humans are looking for productive and meaningful work. And there's no way to do that in like a one size fits all manner. Like we know this as human beings in our everyday life. Our worst teachers are the ones who show everybody the same video and give everybody the same worksheet. One size fits all. That's the worst teacher that you've ever had, is that teacher. The worst book that you've ever read is trying to appeal to the least common denominator. All of the worst things are universal, across the board applications. Those are the worst things at solving problems because they're not particularized. The great thing about communities is by nature, they're particularized. Like the way that you deal with these, as the Bible would put it, the widow and the orphan is in their community. Like there is a personal responsibility there. So for me, there's not a government solution. I think that's a natural desire for people to want to be able to vote and then something gets better. I don't think our biggest challenges are fixed that way. I think the way that you fix this sort of problem is you do roll up your sleeves, you get involved with the community, You get involved with groups of people who do need assistance. And, that's especially like in our country, our homelessness issue is very much a mental health issue. Those two things are very linked. So there's plenty of ways for you to help individuals who are in need of constant assistance. There's plenty of ways to find meaningful work. You just don't do that by voting for some sort of utopian, give everybody $1,000 and they get in their virtual reality world and waste their life away.
Well, very well said. And yeah, I agree with, I didn't want to say that first. I want to give you a chance to say your views. But yeah, that's right in sync with my thoughts. Also too, because there is a relationship there where I think Americans particularly are very generous and they would have no problem giving a lot to programs if they thought there really were checks in place to make sure the person that we're giving this money to really is like down on his luck and he's going to, if he's able to, he's going to go get a job or whatever, you know what I mean? As opposed to if it becomes institutionalized and sort of like an entitlement, then all of a sudden it becomes perpetual. Then it's like, oh yeah, that once that family gets in that trap, the kids grow up thinking this is normal, right? And then it just keeps going on for generations. So I think there is that two-pronged approach that it kind of does. The money would become forth voluntarily if people could see that, yes, it's being used responsibly. And so then that would take the pressure off. Oh, we need to have the political solution because what if the private soup kitchens aren't going to, have enough to go around?
Yeah. And to tack on, I just very briefly at the end there, the difficulty with doing this, especially with government, is oftentimes these situations are matters of just judgments, right? An individual sees a situation and they have to make a judgment. Is this person really in need or are they taking advantage of the system? Or would I help this person who is in need by giving them money right now, or would I help them another way? That's a matter of judgment. And judgment is what our bureaucratic establishment struggles the most with, because bureaucracies thrive on evaluation. They want a scorecard with particular categories. They want to prove that they didn't do anything wrong. And so they lay out their way they're going to do it. They do it the same every time to meet the categories. It's antithetical to judgment. That's what the entrepreneur does. The entrepreneur has to make the call. They may have their idiosyncratic ways of doing it, but it's not a scorecard, right? So the bureaucracies operate off of an evaluative scorecard. The way to solve this problem is via judgment. There's just not a lot of room for judgment in a bureaucracy that, as Mises says, is fundamentally conservative. And I don't mean politically conservative. I mean, They're trying to avoid making a mistake more than they're trying to do anything else.
Well, yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, that's the good point to end on, that you walk right into what I was going to say, that Mises writes on this. And I think he would argue, given that the government agency does have to provide certain services, you almost do want it to be bureaucratic in the sense, because then there's no danger of them excluding, unpopular groups. You know what I mean? If there's a check mark, so that somebody can pretty much determine ex post, did you do what you were supposed to do as the government agent? Yes or no. So there, you kind of do want it to be rigid and for it to be a checklist to make sure they are sort of doing the rule of law and treating everybody the same, like you're saying. But if we're trying to use that approach in situations where you really don't want to treat everyone the same, then you get into trouble.
Yeah, government throws you for all the way from first best to third best right away. It skips over even the second best. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. Yep.
Okay, well, folks, my guest has been Peter Jacobsen. Peter, thanks so much for writing this article and coming on to talk about it.
Thank you again for having me, Bob. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.